Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to the way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am your gracious host, Captain Frodo. And again, what a pleasure it is to have you with me here today. The response to the podcast that dropped last week, my very first podcast, has been so amazing. Around the world, people have been listening to the voice of a lone showman in a town where showbiz used to be so vibrant and alive, now hasn't got a single show anywhere. And in a world that hasn't got shows anywhere, there's a lone showman sitting, transmitting out into the world, and it has been so lovely to know that there are people out there receiving what I'm putting out. People have been downloading it around the world. Some internet service has been sending me emails telling me how I've been doing. Not that I ever asked for it, but apparently we hit the 5th most downloaded podcast in the performing arts section of iTunes in Norway, which is tremendous. With the population of Norway, that means we had somewhere between 11 and 14 downloads. But here at the here at the Way of the Showman, we are just happy to know that there are people out there listening, because this is not your average podcast. It's not a podcast for average people. It's a special podcast for special people such as yourself. The strangeness of the world is the topic of today's talk. It's a brand new talk, never been seen anywhere before. It's not an old podcast or an old blog post redone. This is brand new, coming straight at you as we speak. But enough of this rambling. The bell is ringing. The time has come. It is showtime. And this is your captain speaking. Come with me. It's time to sail the seas of imagination. All aboard the Showmanship for one more journey. Welcome to the new world. This month began like the last few, with everything tainted by the pandemic. It's still a thing. Here in Las Vegas, the Strip, with its many casinos, is only just opening. Still no news about the resurrection of showbiz. And the fact that I am needing to write about it a third month in a row is a testament to how many days we've spent in lockdown. I spoke to my brother from another family, Hamish McCormick of Carnival Cinema fame, just the other day. And after publishing an online blog magazine for several years, he finally took the step to create an unbelievably good-looking, content-rich paper, real-life, in your hand, something you can hold magazine of culture, music, circus, and showmanship. And the magazine is called Fluke and was launched to the world during the Adelaide Fringe Festival, which is probably the largest gathering of our tribe of circus, comedy, and carnival stuff. There's rides, it's in a beautiful garden. It's all over town, actually. It's physical theatre, dance, music, and all sorts of general good times. Anyway, this festival goes for a month, and it finished on the 15th of March 2020. And by that stage, the world had already changed here. We were in full lockdown here in Las Vegas, and many places were already closed off by then. The funny thing about this is that Hamish got that magazine out just before the pandemic hit, which is interesting, since the next issue, which will come out later in the year, will be about a completely different world. For our industry, this is a watershed moment. It'll be a before and after the pandemic delineation. Like, we'll be saying, I remember in the days before the pandemic, we used to spit water at the audience. People used to sit on people's laps, and people used to kiss and pash on the lips. And I used to do that in my street show. All this will be a thing of the past. A performing arts and culture magazine like Fluke will now naturally have to, from here on, be about creative ways that circus folks and performing artists and other practitioners of the craft of showmanship will rebound and rebuild, reimagine, and integrate performance in this changed world. The virus has come to stay, and for the foreseeable future, it will be our working environment. It's like an asteroid has hit the circus, and now we'll see which carnival creatures will re-emerge from the rubble. This month began, as I said, with the world being broken by just the pandemic. But then, here in the United States, came the killing of George Floyd by the police, infuriating and revolting, and captured in terrifying detail. With all the tension already built up from being locked down and ongoing racial injustices, the world was a tinderbox. Protests ignited all over America and then the world. I watched this video where Trevor Noah eloquently pointed out that this was the moment what he called the societal contract was torn up. This is like the agreement that we all implicitly signed about what we can expect from society and what society can expect from us. You know, like we'll abide by the law if the law protects us. And living by this unspoken contract is an important part of what makes a free society, what makes it possible. The contract has been broken for a very long time, and this awful video became the butterfly wings that sparked a worldwide righteous storm. I've not got so much to add about this other than that I'm sorry. I'm as flawed as anyone, as guilty as the rest. Black lives matter, black freedom of expression and dignity matters, and it is high time to readdress that social contract. I hope when we are finished straightening out the ripped pieces and taping it all back together again, with all the improvements that are needed, that it'll be a contract worthy of everyone's signatures. Everyone's signatures. The world has become like a bad TV show. A show of many seasons, like any old realistic TV drama, and you've been following along with the seasons, and then all of a sudden, mid-season 5, it introduces a deadly virus pandemic, only to become about a fascist police state in the next episode. And this is like murdering innocent people. And it's now become a dystopian sci-fi horror show, and it wasn't what you signed up for, and we wouldn't accept writing like this in our TV viewing. That kind of genre swapping is considered bad writing. But what is so riveting is that it is also reality TV. So it's reality, social media, and the authenticity of the drama results in an experience of real horror. For the deep feeling of real horror comes from feeling like your reality is being undermined. Your reality is liquefying beneath your feet. We've lost our solid ground, and we're dealing with water, with ocean, and no amount of force can flatten the waves of a storm. And the chaos is flooding out into the streets. But turning back to my personal hobby horse of showmanship, it seems a pale and unimportant horse in the light of what's going on in the world. But inside my quarantine lockdown bubble and a bubble of my own stormy brain, the show still goes on and remains the lens through which I view the world. So for the next section of this month's episode, why don't you come with me into a poetic and philosophical wilderness of a different and more internal geography than the chaotic liquidity of the one beyond our doorsteps. Without crowds gathering for good times, my worlds have been completely shaken. A crowd is an essential part not just of what a showman does, but also of who the showman is. Crowds form one of the fundamental pillars of showmanship. Crowd, showman, show. Neither of these can be properly understood except in direct relationship with each other. Crowd, showman, show. 3 parts of one thing. A trinity, if you will. So in a sense, when the crowds disappear, the showman disappears as well. And without an audience watching, there isn't really a show happening. Even if the showman runs through his material in an empty room, the showman show becomes nothing but a rehearsal, a run-through of the material. It is the crowd that gives the show meaning. Under the watchful eye of the crowd, the material presented is being transfigured into a show. Since, as of the middle of June 2020, there's still no real timeline for when it will be legal for crowds to gather to watch shows, it seems strangely pointless to even rehearse. This is the core of my particular existential crisis. Who I am is completely entangled with groups of strangers. Crowds in the outer world enable me to make a living, and crowds in a more inner philosophical sense gives my life meaning. As a follower of the way of the showman, that is. The feeling is similar to an earthquake. When something as fundamental as the solidity of the ground you stand on shifts and rocks and violently shakes, the emotional impact can be substantial, triggering a feeling of real horror. And I am lucky to never have been more than mildly shaken by one of these formidable geological events. And after having your foundations shaken, the world continues, life resumes, but the experience lingers on, sometimes permanently. A thing you trusted, a thing so foundational that you took it for granted to the point of not ever really being conscious of it, can't be trusted anymore. What was solid is now liquid. What can you trust if not your foundations? It calls for re-evaluation, a reimagining of your foundations. And this psychological, philosophical, and practical call to arms. When the world turns to water, what do you do? What do I do? Well, for the last month or so, I have been retreating into the imagination. It started with me reading a very interesting book, which I highly recommend, called The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination by Gary Lachman. And in this book, Lachman makes a wonderful case for the imagination not just being something frivolous and fanciful, but as a whole other way of understanding the world. He beautifully traces this idea of this lost knowledge through all these interesting people like Goethe and Owen Barfield, William Blake, Kathleen Ryan, and Samuel Coleridge, amongst others. And the basic idea he presents is that there is more than one way to learn about the world. Science is an excellent and a paramount method for getting exact knowledge about the world around us. There is, however, a whole world inside us with emotions, thoughts, and powerful desires to do things in the world, which can benefit from being looked at in a different way than by focusing on what can be measured and weighed. All in all, the scientific method is but a few hundred years old, yet in this time it has almost completely overtaken us as the only way of interacting with the world, hence making the way we connected with the world from when we lived in caves up until the rise of scientific investigation, which is a time period of hundreds of thousands of years, the way we perceive the world in all of that time. This is the lost knowledge that he speaks about in the book. And I mean, this is this dichotomy that goes through my life, so I'll be the first to admit that I have a problem with making things up. If as soon as you make a case for anything at all which can't be correlated with something that's correspondent in the world, there's a very real possibility that you have just made something up. If you then start treating imaginative knowledge as the same kind of truths we arrive at in the outer world through science, a whole new world of problems might arise. And that said, even though there are limitations to the knowledge of the imagination, there are also limitations to the knowledge of science. And reading Lachman's book made me think of another creator and thinker which wasn't included in the book. And I'm thinking of Werner Herzog, the German filmmaker. But he has also got his own ideas of two kinds of truth, and he calls them the accountant's truth. And the accountant's truth is clear facts, the kind that's found in the telephone directory. And then he talks about ecstatic truth. Herzog is most interested in the second kind when he creates his art, as the first kind doesn't speak much important truth to humanity, as he sees it. Random bits of fact might be good knowledge, but wisdom comes from connecting the facts in a meaningful way. And both Herzog and Lachmann does not shy away from placing human beings at the very center of this meaning. Herzog's ecstatic truth is a human experience. Herzog has a beautiful dichotomy in his work, where he at once presents the world in an almost Lovecraftian way, uncaring of humanity. The universe exists, and it is vast, empty, cold, and oblivious to us in almost a menacing and hostile way. And Herzog says the uncaring world is filled with misery, but not a misery maliciously aimed at humanity in particular. To him, human beings are insignificant in the greater scope. Yet the unflinching depths of the kinds of questions that he asks his interview subjects in his documentaries are about profound emotions. He's got this great German accent, and he's asking them these probing, very direct questions about soul, the meaning of existence, poetry, hope, and dreams. And to me, Herzog's work, all his movies and documentaries, embodies a coming together of explorations of both the outer and the inner, always seeking a poetic, ecstatic truth in the cold facts of the accountant's truth. An artist Lachmann does mention, and does write about in his book, is the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote The Ancient Mariner, made him, you might have heard that, water, water, everywhere, and all the boards did shrink, and water, water, everywhere, and not a drop to drink. That Coleridge with the albatross. Anyway, he distinguished between two kinds of imaginary thinking. One which he called fancy, which he thought of as just combining elements that already exists in your consciousness, like how you can puzzle together random things in collage, like a dog with arms made from strangler vines is a kind of fancy. Each of the elements already exists in the world, and only their combination creates any kind of novelty. And the other kind of creative human power he called imagination. That's the true imagination, and he divides this imagination into two kinds. The primary type of imagination is the one which is shared by all humanity, and it is what allows us to unconsciously understand the structure of the world. It is the faculty in us which ties together all of the sensory impressions that we get into concepts that we can understand. It is this primary kind of imagination which ties together all the different perceptions, like the fluttering greens above and the green lines that are crisscrossing the green, and then a thick vertical column. And from all of this different stuff and the rustling that you hear, it puts together these things into a tree in our minds. So it's this kind of imagination that gives us knowledge about the world. To be able to put together the random sensory impressions and put it together into a thing might seem like a trivial thing, but as the research into artificial intelligence and pattern recognitions in computer, it turns out that it is not quite as easy as what you imagine when you're a human being to put these things together so you understand what is one thing and what is something else. Coleridge's second kind of imagination is the kind of imagination that we think of as imagination perhaps today, and that is the domain of the poet. It's the kind of imagination which is specific to the artist, and which, as Coleridge describes it, sort of dissolves and diffuses and dissipates in order to recreate. And in this way, the poet engages in a conversation with the phenomena of the world by studying them each in their own right, stripping them back, squinting in the process, and from this glean a new understanding. It's similar in a way to a deep human conversation, where two people can share their impressions and opinions on the topic, and then, if both are open to it, they can reach a new and enriched understanding of the topic. Like the initial part of the conversation is the planting of a seed, and the second part is the development of the plant. Nurtured in just the right way, it might even flower. A flower that you would not have been able to discover, or and this might be an insight that you wouldn't have been able to discover except for in this shared and open imagination. If you open yourself in the right way, the conversation with the person or with the world can go beyond a simple piecing together of ideas and opinions and become a discerning discovery of the topic as it imaginally unfolds like a thing in itself. This is an attempt at sketching out this other kind of imagination, and I've found this concept very interesting, and it's a big topic, and I'll get back to it in the future, but it's something which I am only just awakening to, and it feels like a fertile idea space for inspiration for anyone who is interested in the craft of showmanship, any artist or poet. Which brings us on to this thing that I'm thinking about, and this is that in this last month I have also been reading poetry. I've been reading David Whyte, a particular favorite of mine, but closer to home, or my ancestral home. I've been listening to recordings made by a poet called Kolbein Falkeid, and he's a poet from my hometown in Norway, a small coastal town which, as the saying goes, was built with herring bones. This refers to the herring which used to migrate up along the west coast of Norway, and the fishing industry which sprung up with it, which quite literally placed the city of Haugesund on the map, spectacularly placed as it is at the heart of the fjordland. One of the things that's special about poets is that they aren't afraid of deep conversations. Conversations not just with people, but with places, and with the frontiers of geographies, both inner and outer. Armed with, according to Coleridge, their very own kind of imagination. Poets, at least the good ones, let themselves sink into the reality which lies beneath the surface of appearances. And I say good poetry, as there is a lot of bad poetry too. And this reminds me of a line from a poem by Charles Bukowski about the reason why there exists so much bad poetry in the world. There'll always be money and whores and drunkards, down to the last bomb. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. There's even a myth from the Norse mythology explaining where all this endless bad poetry comes from, but that'll be something for another time. Kolbein Falkeid has a lot of good poetry. I discovered an incredible poem the other day about some beach toys left behind by a child, and hearing him recite it in an audiobook just shook my foundations, which has been the theme of this month, and I shook it in a poetic way, in its weaving together of images of sand, sea, sleep, children, and forgotten toys becoming like little fires we can warm ourselves by as our childhood sails away to distant horizons. The poem reveals a deeper truth, something which is so very much alive and connected, something so deep and direct I can't defend myself against it. A glimpse of a different aspect of reality comes alive between the words in the swirls and waves of its different strands of meaning which splash against the beach frontier of my mind. And the poem is in Norwegian, and I won't even attempt at translating it here, but I trust that you, my dear listener, have the imaginative power to sense the kind of shift of consciousness a meeting with a poetic or ecstatic truth can have. Leaving it unsaid and merely imagined can sometimes get closer to the truth than a shallow synopsis anyway. And Colbein Falkeid uses the imagery of coasts, ocean, boats and fishermen in his poetry. And this is such an immense part of the appearances for those living with the roiling chaos of the North Sea at their literal doorsteps, which is what I grew up with. Those who know me well knows that I am most un-Viking-like. I get fiercely seasick, so although many of my friends and colleagues makes a good living on cruise ships, there's no way I can make a good living on a cruise ship. Cruise ship life would be nauseating and vomit-inducing living for me. And anyway, who knows what will become of cruise ship living for now. The poetry of nautical imagery, though, has revealed a different, imaginal sea where perhaps I would not feel so sick with the swellings of the waves. The nautical foundations of Colbein Falkeid's poetry has become a medicine, a motion sickness tablet to calm my inner nausea and the feeling of seasickness in this new liquid reality we all find ourselves in. It's calmed my churning stomach enough for me to rediscover my way, imaginatively, and finding it transformed. Not by a fanciful, making shit up kind of imagination, but the kind of imagination that connects me to the world and lets me participate more fully in it. The pressure of the pandemic's reality earthquake has allowed me to reimagine the way of the showman, not as a path to walk, but rather as a guiding star that I can set my course by. I go from treading water, just trying to stay alive, to swimming in this new liquid reality. The situation of losing one's way is a dark night of the soul. I worry about whether the shows will start, whether I'll be able to continue to stay in America and be able to pay the bills. And in that dark place, I forgot one thing about stars, and that is, they only come out at night. They're always there, but you can only see them when it gets dark, and the darker it gets, the more stars you can see. We all could do well to use this dark time to pick out our guiding star and set our course onward. And with that, we've come to the end of today's thoughts. And I would just like, before we end this episode, to ask you to take a minute out of your day to go to the main whatever place you get your podcasts from and give us 5 stars. The ratings means a lot more than what the people who casually listen might imagine. Makes it easier for other people to find it. If you would, like some people have, write me a very excellent review, that is also very, very much appreciated. And if you can think of any of your friends who enjoy a good podcast or enjoy the kind of topics that we talk about here, people who are artists, people who are showfolk around the world that might want to live a more closely examined life, this might be the podcast for them. And you can find this podcast at Apple Podcast or at Spotify or Stitcher or Overcast or wherever you get your good podcasts from. But anyway, that's all I'm going to ask you for. Until next time, all that's left to say is take care of yourself, those you love, and I hope to see you all along the way.